The Brothers Evans, a wee tale of love and heartbreak by Libby Broadbent, based on the artwork of Robert LaDuke. They both loved her, Miss Theodora Mackenzie of Schenectady, New York, for how could they not? When Everett became mutely confounded by the lush foliage of her russet hair, Ezekiel would elucidate the marvels of her aqua eyes. Should Everett mention in passing at the breakfast table that Miss Theodora's skin rivaled the rich buttermilk their mother served them with their biscuits, then Ezekiel would, naturally, parry with a muttered analogy between chocolate drops and the freckles which blessed that very buttermilk skin, making passing allusion to their daring descent down the deep declivity of the breasts in question, whereupon Everett would be obliged to rise thunderously to his feet and demand propriety when in discussion of the woman he was going to marry. He would invariably break a plate in his ascension. Ezekiel would hurl his napkin to the table, declaring his intentions for the hand of the freckled maid. A teacup was often a fatality of this expressive gesture. Everett would sputter and stammer, as was his way when agitated, his face creeping red and blotchy, his eyes watering as his passionate heart palpitated. He had been known to crush a juice glass in one large fist when in such high temper. Ezekiel would recite poetry, as was his way when agitated, much to the annoyance of their mother, the widow Evans, who despised both poetry and passion, and would just like to see one of her sons marry the woman before all the crockery in the house was broken. I loved her first, but afterwards her love, outsoaring mine, sang such a loftier song as drowned the friendly cooings of my dove. Ezekiel felt no qualms at altering whatever poem happened to come to him to suit his needs, as he knew full well that his brother could barely read the delivery sheets for his rounds, never mind be familiar with the greater lyricism of the bards. I, you, she... Everett flexed his shoulders, his massive arms straining at the fabric of the shirt, which his beloved had once mentioned as being a lovely shade of blue which matched his eyes. Although the boys had shared their mother's womb, the widow Evans had often suggested, being a tiny waif of a woman barely sturdy enough to withstand a strong wind, that Everett had consumed the lion's share of the meager nourishment her gestating body could provide, while Ezekiel had absorbed the wisdom of the ages from the scraps his twin left him. Ezekiel was the brains, Everett the brawn, and together they made a fine man. Miss Theodora Mackenzie was tearing them apart. Quit your blubbering, both of you, and go deliver the bread. Mother would calmly interrupt their testosterone-infused gallantry, deftly picking up shards of crockery with her dish towel. And neither of you even bother arguing over who delivers the best bread. Bread is bread. Girls is girls. Only one of you can have her, so you'd best just flip a coin and get it over with. Philip's bread is soft and delicious, Everett would mutter under his breath. Everett had been delivering Philip's bread in his green and orange truck for almost 10 years. Ezekiel had delivered Amelie bread and rolls in his black and yellow truck for exactly the same amount of time. Amelie bread and rolls are as soft as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills. Ezekiel was about to pontificate further on the texture and color of his far superior product, but his words were abruptly startled out of his chest by the meat of Everett's fist being laid rather forcefully between his shoulder blades. Everett often had a physical reaction to Ezekiel's poetry. Philip's is better. Everett stomped past his brother, grabbed his white delivery jacket off the coat rack, and rammed his Philip's bread cap on his large head. His hair bristled around the brim like exclamation points frightened out of his scalp. Ezekiel followed rather more slowly, gently encouraging air to return to his lungs. The twin brothers, one large and one small, climbed aboard their respective bread delivery trucks, parked side by side in uneasy collusion in their mother's driveway. Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul, wheezed Ezekiel, brushing a speck of dirt off the dash of his Amelie bread and rolls delivery truck. Ezekiel shook his head at the folly of whatever god it was that had contrived their fate, sharing the same womb, loving the same woman, and delivering the same product. He only wished there could be more poems about bread. Miss Theodora Mackenzie was not, as might be supposed, a winsome or delicate member of the fairer sex. She stood almost as tall as her dual suitors, and could look both in the eye with only the merest tilt of her freckled chin. Her hair, as has been suggested, was a wild and untamable mane of auburn splendor, which she invariably hijacked into submission with a twist of twine twirled tightly at the base of her sturdy neck. Her hands were large, her shoulders broad, her breasts mighty stalwart peaks that caused poor Ezekiel on more than one occasion to moan, "Were there below a spot of holy ground, where from distress a refuge might be found, and solitude prepare the soul for heaven, sure nature's God that spot to man had given between Theodora's bosoms." Everett, silently clamping his hand tightly around his brother's wrist on more than one occasion, and hurling him over the settee, was inclined to agree. Yet, despite the young Miss Theodora's undeniable physical lustiness, there lingered in her heart a vigor of an entirely different ilk. Theodora's heart yearned for independence, for success on her own terms, for adventure and freedom and emancipation from the shackles of womanhood her unfortunate possession of a womb had her tethered to. Miss Theodora Mackenzie wanted to be a farmer, not notably a farmer's wife, nor a bread and rolls delivery man's wife either, for that matter. But Theodora was not insensitive to the missiles of testosteronic affection being hurled her way by the twin brothers, just as she was not insensitive to the desires that burned in her own loins when she watched Everett casually toss 50-pound crates of bread with one well-muscled hand, or when she cracked open her window on a sultry July evening to the dulcet tones of Ezekiel reciting sonnets below her casements, causing the fervent heart encased beneath her magnificent breasts to beat with the wanton pleasures of youth. Oh, she wanted them both, did young Miss Mackenzie. One for the brawn, the other for the brain. The problem arose in the choosing, and then in the ridding, for she had no intention of keeping either man. The dependence and oppression of marriage ran counter to her dream of becoming a liberated lady farmer, and she had no intention of squandering her ambitions for a muscled bicep or a cleverly worded haiku, no matter how heated her blood became at the thought of either. It is not to be known what it was that led her to it. Was it the complexity of youthful folly, the restrictive snugness of her undergarments limiting oxygen to the decision-making lobe of her feisty brain, the innocent desire to spare both men the despair that her neglect would most surely have caused? Whatever the reasoning, young Theodora Mackenzie began a vigorous, albeit ill-advised, seduction of both of the brothers Evans, with no intent to wed, no intent to woo, no intent indeed to mislead, but merely to cool the overheated conjunction of her thighs in as merry a way as possible, whilst she continued to dream of acres and fertilizer and husbandry in the most agricultural sense of the word. She dreamed, mostly, of cows. Everett bought her a horse. This, after a particularly rousing afternoon spent in her company, when she called him her swaggering cowboy, and made most complimentary comments about the size of his belt buckle. Ezekiel, not to be outdone, purchased for her a truckload of pumpkins. This, after a most salubrious afternoon in her company, when she called him a silly pumpkin-head, after an ardent poetical recitation, wherein after each phrase he kissed a hammer-like toe on her sturdy foot. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy toves, didst gyre and gimble in the wabe." When she suggested, with dewy breathlessness, that he could gyre and gimble in her wabe, his poetic efforts had stuttered into a more guttural utterances of bliss. Everett, dimly aware that his brother seemed uncharacteristically ebullient during dinner as his poetic ejaculations drifted so far from the classics as to include a seemingly endless recitation of an Aerosmith ballad, "Don't want to close my eyes, I don't want to fall asleep, 'cause I'd miss you, baby, and I don't want to miss a thing." In response, Everett bought his lady love a tractor, with which he squashed several of the hundreds of pumpkins she had scattered over her yard. Ezekiel, then, bought her a house, which he delivered on the back of a flatbed truck. On a plaque he had affixed to the kitchen wall, just above the countertop, where she thanked him most enthusiastically for his gift, he had inscribed, in curling cursive wound through with leaves and blossoming flowers, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Implying, perhaps, as he suggested between panted breaths as she bestowed her appreciation upon his narrow frame, that he was the road she was meant to take. She took him, but made no promise regarding other roads she might traverse. Everett bought a plane. "Mum, I bought her a plane," he said in a rare moment of verbosity. "It's a fast plane." The mother of the twins, Widow Evans, sighed. It was a sigh that threatened to undo the tenuous connection between her ribs and her spine, being as she was a mere waif of a woman, subject to extreme disruptions of the spirit caused by the conflict between her 2 sons. How she longed for unbroken crockery and unbroken peace in her home. "Girls is girls, Everett. Find one you don't have to buy a plane for." It was sound advice, as mother's advice often is, and it went unheeded, as mother's advice often does, and Widow Evans sighed, as mothers often do, as her burly son roared off in the squat airship with which he hoped to win the hand of the freckled maid. "I should write her a poem," wheezed Ezekiel, entering the room to the fading roar of his brother's flight to romance. "I've never written my own before. I believe I should be worthy of the name Bard. What do you think, mother? Will she marry me if I am Bard, Ezekiel?" "Correct me if I'm wrong, sweet son, but I believe young miss is looking for hard, Ezekiel, not Bard. And having done with that, I believe she may well be done with you." Widow Evans had been around the block a time or two, if you know what I mean. She was no stranger to the heat that burned bright in Miss Theodora Mackenzie's loins, although her own fire had been quenched many a long year before and had been replaced most satisfactorily by an appreciation of fine china. She missed the Mr. Evans more than she dare say, but she had her eye on a set of Wedgwood which simply wouldn't withstand the ardor of her son's infatuation. She needs must do something to stop the madness. For her part, Miss Theodora Mackenzie was satisfied. Several times satisfied, in fact, yet there ached in her heart a yearning for freedom, for emancipation, for liberation from the restrictions imposed on her by her own libidinous soul. The horse was nice, the pumpkins round, the house cozy, and the plane, well, it was a plane. But she still yearned for something more. Her quandary over the brothers Evans deepened as she explored every crack and crevice of that fraternal crucible, and she found it ever harder to decide. Which one? But not which one to keep, rather which one to discard first. She determined, in the obstreperousness of her whimsy, to engage her lovers in a series of trials which would serve the dual purpose of entertaining her and simplifying her choice of which man to make redundant first. Do not think, gentle reader, that our heroine was completely lacking in social graces, empathy, kindness, and morality. Quite the contrary. Miss Theodora Mackenzie congratulated herself on her altruistic approach to manhandling, with the entirely reasonable reasoning that both men had had the milk for free. Therefore, it would be unkind to expect only one to buy the cow. As it turned out, it was the Widow Evans who bought the cow. Theodora's first challenge was to encourage the brothers Evans to race, in race cars, across the barren salt flats in pursuit of her favor. It ended in a tie. The second was a marathon between car and plane, over bridges and valleys and mountain ranges. Again, the brothers proved each other's equal within a hair's breadth of each other. The third was a battle with a bullet, where Theodora donned her most snug, most revealing, most enticing bathing costume, and, raising her rifle to her capacious shoulder, shot a single bullet down a straight thoroughfare, past the house Ezekiel bought her, past the pumpkins of Everett, creating a fright and stampede from the horse Ezekiel had gifted her with, and landing with a chilling twang in the tail wing of the plane which Everett had used to woo her passionately into his massive arms. But neither man was able to race the bullet, as the trial demanded, due to the intoxicating distraction of the bathing costume. Theodora called it a draw. It was, after all, a very fetching bathing costume. Throughout all of the trials and tribulations of Theodora's undertakings, there followed a steady shattering of pottery in the kitchen of the Widow Evans. Everett's door slamming, Ezekiel's exuberant remonstrance regarding his brother's alleged predilection for cheating, Everett's insistence that Ezekiel's face would look better crushed beneath one of their mother's china platters, all culminated in an apocalypse of earthenware destruction to Widow Evans's decision to intervene. "Theodora Mackenzie," the venerable widow hissed outside the door to the house her erstwhile and amorous son had bequeathed to the strumpet in question, "come out here this instant before I go in there and drag you out by your damnable tresses. Or, as Ezekiel would say, oh fleecy hair, fallen in curls to the shoulder, oh black locks, oh perfume laden with nonchalance." Let it be known that while Ezekiel's predilection for poetry was not appreciated in his household, it was, perhaps, genetic. "I'll nonchalance ye all right, ye wee hussy," Widow Evans muttered under her breath as the cinnamon cascade of curls in question came into view. "Widow Evans," Theodora simpered. "I've bought ye a cow. Now leave my boys alone." Indeed, in the yard there stood a cow, chewing its cud in blessed bovine ignorance of all matters of the heart, the hearth, and the hussy. "A cow?" Theodora blinked. "A cow." "How did you know I needed a cow?" "Because you don't need either of my sons." "No," Theodora agreed. She smiled the smile of innocence and youth and concupiscence. "But they are smashing good fun." For Mother Evans, it was as if an entire shelf of porcelain came crashing down at her feet. Mother Evans reached out one cadaverous arm, the thinness of which caused Theodora to glance around for a hearse or an undertaker, or at the very least a doctor, should the suddenness of the gesture and the diminutiveness of the perpetrator result in tragedy. Mother Evans reached out her tiny arm and struck Theodora a shocking blow on the cheekbone, snapping our young heroine's head back and causing her to stagger against the doorframe. Let it be known that while Everett's great strength and musculature were not always appreciated in his household, they were perhaps genetic. "Boys is boys. Cows is cows," Mother Evans intoned. "Leave my boys and my crockery in peace." And so it came to pass, due to a tremulous fear instilled by a waif of a woman whose looks were deceiving and whose bite was at least as bad as her bark, that the young Theodora Mackenzie embraced her new life as a liberated lady farmer, disregarding the attentions of young men near and far in favor of the pleasures of buying her own cows and having her own milk for free. The brothers Evans, meanwhile, were baffled by the sudden cessation of the affections of their mutual inamorata. "I understand," Ezekiel whimpered to his mother, "why she would stray away from the pre-Cambrian pummeling offered by my brother, but what could have possessed her to reject me?" "It's a mystery," agreed his mother, massaging her right hand. "Tonight I can write the saddest lines. I loved her, and sometimes she loved me too. Through nights like this one I held her in my arms. I kissed her again and again under the endless sky," Ezekiel moaned. "Okay," agreed his mother, cradling a teapot in her withered lap. Everett slammed the door. The teapot shivered. "She dump you?" he asked his brother. "Indeed, I am bereft. She walks in beauty like the night." Everett clamped his large hand on his brother's thin shoulder with such force that Ezekiel's teeth clinked together like delicate china teacups. Their mother shivered. "Me too." The two boys stood in momentary and fleeting commiseration, Everett pondering random acts of violence, Ezekiel rhapsodizing his loss in silent recitation of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, while the widow Evans quietly replaced the teapot on the shelf, smiled, and began polishing her newest collection of Wedgwood fine china. The end.